Hello, everyone. Welcome to MSUFCU's Financial Education Seminar Series. We appreciate you all joining us today. We're excited to be here with you this afternoon. These presentations were really created with you in mind, with the intention to give financial education on a number of relatable topics to help expand your knowledge of finances. We have a number of diverse presentations planned for you this year, and you can register for those by visiting us at msufcu.org/events. Today's event is being recorded. You can rewatch or share the recorded presentations by going to youtube.com/MSUFCU and then selecting the seminar series from the playlist options. You can also use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit any questions that you have for our presenter today, and then we'll go ahead and get those answered at the end as she concludes her presentation. And we'll also provide some additional resources in the chat, but go ahead and any questions you have, use that Q&A function within Zoom. So my name is Therese Bacon. I'll be your facilitator this afternoon. If you do have any, technology issues or anything like that, go ahead and reach out to me in the chat and I'll try to help you through there. So, as August is Make a Will Month, we wanted to focus on why this piece of your estate planning is so important and what you can do to prepare. So, allow me to introduce our host, Rian Horgan, CEO of Silver. Silver provides members like you with retirement calculators, tools, and education through Retirement Simplified, which you all probably have already, but if not, we'll give you some information on that towards the end. Prior to founding Silver, Rianne worked for 17 years at JP Morgan, where she advised individuals and families on investments, credit, and wealth planning. We're excited to have her here with us today to help us help guide us through this very important topic. So welcome to you, Rianne, and I'll turn it over to you to go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience and lead right into your presentation.
All right, Therese. Well, thank you so much for hosting us today, and thanks very much to all the MSUFCU members. I'd say kudos, first of all, for taking the time to have this conversation. I know estate planning is always a topic that I think keeps getting, I would say that people keep kicking the can down the road. And so just taking the time today to really think about it, I think is kind of a huge move in making sure that your wishes are followed. Um, Many of you on the call today may already have an estate plan in place, and so we're really going to be focusing in on, for those of you that are over 50, is how that plan may evolve and things that you may not have put in place before, things to be thinking about today. So as we go through today, the one thing I did want to just flag is that we are going to be taking Q&A. So, Therese, are folks putting it into the chat, or how are they going to put their questions in
Yeah,
just so
so
we can?
Yep. So again, I'll say right at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there should be that Q&A
Yep,
button. So you can go ahead and click that. If for
perfect.
some reason you don't see that on your screen, you can also send them directly to me in the chat, and then we'll get to those at the end.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so why don't we kick off? I want to just maybe give a little bit of context before we kick off about Silver and Retirement Simplified, because we're going to cover a good amount of content today, and I didn't want you all to feel like you had to be scrambling to take lots of notes. So the good news is that we have this member benefit called Silver within the MSU experience where you can access this information online after the session. As Therese mentioned, there'll also be a webinar. We wanted just to make sure that you had all that information. Within the Silver experience, in addition to there being all the education, we also have a set of tools and calculators so you can do things like estimate your Social Security, estimate your healthcare costs, estimate cost of living depending on where you're planning to live. So a couple different topics that we're going to cover today, and I want to just kind of do this up front so folks can kind of see where the different pieces are. They're going to be relevant for them. We're going to talk about why a will or revising your will probably is important in retirement. We're going to talk about powers of attorney, how to add beneficiaries, some of the basics around trusts. If you're thinking about moving, or perhaps you're thinking about snowbirding, spending some of the time of the year in Florida, how that might impact your estate plan. And then there are some uniquenesses depending on your marital status. And so we're going to spend a few minutes kind of walking through kind of what you should be thinking about based on your marital status. So let's kick off today with a focus on kind of why a will is important. I think for most folks know that one of the primary purposes of a will is to ensure that your assets go to the people and places you want them to go to. If you put a will in place when you were younger, you likely were thinking a lot about protecting your family. So I think about myself, I have 11 and a 13-year-old child. My primary goal when I put my first will together was thinking about guardianship for my children. But as your 11 and 13-year-old grow to be, 25, 30, and they become older, all of a sudden, some of the reasons you put your will together and the thoughts that you had around the structure of the will may have evolved. And so as you think about having a will now, I would also say that if you had one before, really important to re-review, to think again about, are there still family members that might need extra protection and guardianship? And or how do you want your assets to get distributed? You all have worked really hard to save what you have, and I would just say that if you don't have a will, then the state determines how your savings will be distributed. And so this is about really giving you control around how your assets are distributed. So we talked about already, some of you may already have a will. Isn't that going to be enough? I would just flag that there are life changes that need to be accounted for. So it could be a change in marital status. It could be you put a will together when you were married and you're now divorced. Or it could have been a will when you were married and now you're widowed. It could be a change in adult children's need. You could have that child who still hasn't left the basement and you don't want them inheriting a lot of money because they don't have a lot of motivation, right? So thinking about like how distribution of assets can help the kids. It could be new grandkids. It also could be you moved, and we're going to talk a lot about later on about how moving can impact your estate plan. So there's a number of different types of wills. The basic will is what you're probably most likely familiar with. It's the document that says how you want your assets distributed and who should care for your children and pets. A testamentary trust is created out of with a will, and it directs the assets to be held in a trust for beneficiaries. So if you don't want assets going directly to some of your family members, it is creating a trust that assets can be held in. A living will is a document that is really focused on the type of medical care that you want if you can't make decisions for yourself. And then finally, there is a concept called a joint will, which is designed for partners, spouses and partners who want to have the same beneficiaries and provisions. And it particularly stipulates that it can't be changed after one partner dies. And so, a couple different wills to be thinking about. Again, it may be that you've started with a simple will, but, reviewing your fact pattern, deciding whether, you really want the assets to go outright or does there need to be a trust? Have you put in place the living will piece, which maybe when you were younger wasn't something you focused as much on? And again, do you want your spouse to be able to change the will after you pass? Is a really good question to have, jointly as a couple. So when you think about what will is right for you, a couple things I think about is, have your children grown up? Again, thinking about, are you really focused here on guardianship or something else? Has your marital status changed since your last will was updated? Do you feel like your will protects the surviving spouse? Would you prefer the assets to go to a charitable organization? Do you have pets that need to be cared for after you pass? So really thinking about how do you, as you answer those questions, it's going to map you to, okay, well, what's the right type of will that you need? And also have you actually addressed these items in the documentation that you have? So, as we think about that, and Therese, I imagine that there are lots of trust and estate attorneys in Michigan that are available to provide members with the individual support that they need. So I would say what we're trying to really focus on here is helping you think about the wills that you'll need, and then the MSFCU team, I'm sure, will be able to make the connections to kind of help you with that kind of next step of the conversation. So I want to talk a little bit about a power of attorney. And this again is something that is important to think about. When you think about a power of attorney, what you're really thinking about is who are you giving the ability to make decisions on your behalf. So it could be a kind of a general power of attorney, where you're giving a third party the ability to make kind of real estate, financial, business decisions on your behalf. It could be that you only want to give that power of attorney to someone if you're unable to make decisions yourself. And so that's what's called a durable power of attorney, where you're saying, look, I generally can make decisions, but if I'm incapacitated, I want to be able to give that power of attorney to someone else. The medical power of attorney is often called an advanced directive or healthcare proxy. It allows someone else to make decisions about your healthcare and medical treatment if you're not able to. There are also, I would say, power of attorneys that are called limited and springing that are kind of a little bit more specific. I would say the general ones are, are you generally giving someone else to make decisions, the ability to make decisions on your behalf? Again, the durable, it just springs into action if you are unable to make decisions. And then the third is a very specific medical power of attorney, and that's often called a healthcare proxy or advance directive. So as you think about a power of attorney, I think one of the things I would just encourage you to think about is like what are you trying to um, provide guidance or protection around? And so if it's your financial matters, a medical power of attorney isn't going to help you. You really need to have that general or durable power of attorney if you want someone to be able to take over your financial decisions, as an example. Many of you on the phone, and we think about us on the phone, may also be acting as caregivers. So as we're having this conversation, I would just say, I imagine you're thinking about yourself, but I'd also be thinking about older family members. If you are acting as a caregiver for a family member, really important to see, is there a power of attorney in place and what type? Do they have a living will? Have they provided HIPAA authorization? Do they have that will? And then I would also just flag, and this is not as I'd say commonly used, but has your family member considered a caregiver agreement? Oftentimes, what we find is that one child takes on most of the responsibility when they're doing health and financial caregiving for a family member, and mom or dad may reimburse you for expenses, or they may there may be money that's being transferred to cover some of their expenses. And having a caregiver agreement in place can be really helpful if there's any sort of questions around accounting of money movement after the fact. And so, as an example, if mom or dad are paying you to take them to doctor's appointments, or help, or paying you to live in your house, these are things that it's really important to document, so that particularly in the settlement of an estate, if there are questions from other family members around how money is being spent, that you actually have the protection in place to show that this money was properly moved. So when we think about choosing a power of attorney, there's a lot of flexibility who that individual can be. It can be an adult child, it could be a close friend, it could be a spouse, a partner, anyone you trust. Generally, you should be thinking about it as someone who you think will outlive you. Obviously, you can change who that power of attorney is, but I think the general thinking is kind of generally someone who's probably a bit younger than you. What you are thinking about is someone who is trustworthy. Ideally is close. It isn't required, but I think having someone close by can be helpful. And then particularly if you're asking them to have a power of attorney where they can oversee your financial affairs, that you believe that they make smart decisions around money, right? You want to just be thoughtful there, particularly on the durable power of attorney, that you're not giving those rights to someone who isn't going to take, good care of your financial savings. All right, so let's talk about some of the like quick wins, because I think at times estate planning can feel complicated, paperwork that we have to work through, but there's actually some like really easy paperwork that like today MSUFCU can help you with. And so I would just say like the quick win for everyone is making sure you add a beneficiary to your accounts. So when you add a beneficiary to an account, it means that those assets automatically go to that beneficiary and you avoid probate. So if you die with, let's call it just kind of your credit union accounts and your investment accounts, assigning a beneficiary to your accounts is a much more efficient way to distribute your assets than just a will. I think one of the challenges with beneficiaries, and I kind of know this myself, like my first 401k, I didn't have a spouse, I didn't have children, and so I set up my parents and my kids as my beneficiary. Now, or I said my parents and my siblings as my beneficiary. I had to take a proactive step to go back in, particularly on older accounts like 401ks, to rename the beneficiary first to my spouse, and then I have a second beneficiary, which is my kids, in the event that my spouse is not alive. So naming beneficiaries and assigning them is like super, super easy, but you have to keep on top of it, particularly for old accounts. And because once the name is there, you can absolutely change it. But if you die and the name of the beneficiary hasn't been changed, then that is where the assets go. And it does create problems typically with like those 401ks you set up in your 20s that you've forgotten about, maybe some of those smaller accounts. If you haven't been organized about consolidating your IRA accounts or your 401ks, that's where you need to really refresh what the beneficiary looks like. So the first thing I always think about when designating beneficiaries is if you are married, making sure your spouse is listed. The second is adding a secondary beneficiary. And the third is to review them periodically. And I kind of list a couple of family life events that could really drive you wanting to refresh your beneficiaries. It could be birth of a child, death of a family member, a divorce. And I'll just kind of maybe double tap on the divorce for a second, which is if your spouse was listed as your beneficiary and you die and you did not update it, but you got divorced in that time period, they will receive those assets. So very important that after a divorce, you go through and you look at the titling of all of, not only the titling of the account, but the beneficiaries listed on your accounts. All right, let's talk a little bit about trusts. The word trust might evoke the thinking that trusts are just for really wealthy people, but we're going to talk about actually how trusts can be very important for many of us on the phone to really make sure that assets are distributed in the way that it makes sense. And as I mentioned, kind of again, historically, I think a lot of people thought, well, our trust's just for the wealthy, but the reality is that trust can make sense in a lot of other for a lot of other reasons. So the first might be legal protection of assets. It could be, if you have a family member that you're worried has some credit issues and you want to make sure that the assets aren't taken by the creditors, keeping the asset in a trust can actually protect your assets from your beneficiary's creditors. It can help you control how assets are distributed. So, for example, you might have a family member that you want to leave money for, but you might say, look, I want my child or grandchild to receive $50,000, but it can only be used to help with the down payment of a home. Like, I don't want them to receive the $50,000 outright. Well, a trust can help you document and distribute those assets. It could also be that you're leaving a larger sum of money and you don't want the family member to receive it all at once. And what you want them to get is a distribution every year. So it could be that every year I want them to receive a $10,000 distribution. And so the trust helps you do that. A trust can be helpful when you think about hard to divide assets like RVs and vacation homes. Maybe you want the asset to stay in the family, right? It's a family RV or a family vacation home. Well, the trust can actually ultimately own that asset, so you're not kind of distributing the asset to three different family members. The trust can help you avoid probate. Depending on the specifics of the trust, there can be this reduction of estate taxes. And I'd say probably most importantly, trust can be used for children that have special needs. And this could be young children that have special needs, but also older children that have special needs. Um, Particularly as you think about older children who maybe have long-term special needs and perhaps are accessing Medicaid, there are special trusts to hold assets so that providing your family member a home, for example, doesn't preclude them for retaining their eligibility for Medicaid. So there's a couple different types of trusts, and I want to just go through some of the terminology so that folks understand kind of the whys behind these different types of trusts. So the first type of trust is what's called a revocable trust. This is a trust that you can set up today, but you can quote unquote revoke it, meaning you can decide to dissolve the trust in the future. So it's very flexible. It can help avoid probate, but it doesn't provide some of the creditor benefits that we discussed earlier around protecting your assets for beneficiaries from creditors. The irrevocable trusts are much more challenging to change. And so oftentimes folks that set up irrevocable trusts are thinking about, I would say, estate planning and really trying to reduce their federal tax obligations because they're really trying to take the money out of their estate. And by doing that and getting that kind of protection, it is extremely difficult to change. And so when you're not sure who you really want to give the money to, or who you want the beneficiaries to be, that kind of, I'd say that when you're not sure, revocable gives you that flexibility. When you know you're making a decision that you want to stick with forever, the irrevocable can have some benefits. We talked a little bit about special needs, and again, the special needs trusts, typically are set up to support family members that are going to have long-term special needs. That you want to make sure that they have some some income or some assets, but by doing that, you're not making them ineligible for Social Security or Medicaid. Many states have very low thresholds of income that folks are allowed to receive and assets they're allowed to hold to retain eligibility for Medicaid. And then the final kind of big bucket of trusts are what are called generation skipping trusts. And these are trusts that can be set up for grandchildren if you want to perhaps help fund, parts of college education or help fund maybe a bit of a down payment for a grandkid's first home. So there are ways to kind of make that gift to the next generation rather than giving it directly to their parents and hoping that eventually that the grandkids will receive something. So again, here what you can see is that there's a lot of different types of trusts and thinking about the why. If we go back just a second ago, it's again, we're trying to really think about the legal protections. It's, do you want folks getting all their assets at once or over time? Do you have things like a vacation home that you want to stay in the family? Are you trying to protect for family members that have special needs? All of these can be reasons for setting up a trust. And again, it's really thinking about here as you speak with an estate attorney is making sure you get the right type of trust that meets your needs. All right, let's talk about where you live. I think for most folks, when I talk to folks about planning for retirement, they spend a lot of time running the math to understand, where their savings are going to last the longest. And I think for folks that have spent a bunch of time looking at the math, what they realize is that it's not just taxes, it's also cost of living, it's healthcare costs. And so, as you think about this big picture of like where you live, one aspect of where you live in retirement obviously is about family and friends and your social networks. There's the also the aspect of, well, how do you make your savings last as long as possible? What we know is that the taxes vary based on where you live. And so, as an example, if you have a family member or you're thinking about moving to some of these states here, Nebraska, Kentucky, Maryland, Iowa, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, they do have an inheritance tax. And so, in that particular case, the individual that inherits the money will be subject to taxes. It's important to think about, as you do estate planning that, I think about myself, like I grew up in Colorado, lived in Colorado for a long time, and then moved to the state of New York. When you move states, you do need to review your estate plan because there are differences in how the different states accept documentation. As an example, we'll talk about community property states, but if you're moving into or out of a community property state, you have to re-review your plan. If you put a power of attorney in place, and you have what's called a uniform power of attorney in about 30 states, that power of attorney works in all of those states, but there's 20 states that those power of attorneys, that uniform power of attorney does not work. So you need to make sure if you're moving that power of attorney still works. We talked about the inheritance tax, and we'll talk in a second about estate tax. So a couple things I'd be thinking about if you were a family member moves, and I'm going to mention a family member because oftentimes, if you're acting as a caregiver, you may move a family member to be closer to you. And when you do that, what I wanted just to flag is a couple things you really need to be thoughtful of. The first is, where are they domiciled? For those of you that are thinking about spending time between, as an example, Michigan and Florida, one of the big decisions you're going to need to make is, what is your tax domicile? Is your tax domicile going to be Michigan, or is your tax domicile going to be Florida? That has ripple effects from an estate planning perspective. It also has a ripple effect for Medicare, which is, you enroll in Medicare in the state that you're tax domiciled. You need to make sure the assets are properly titled. And this again goes back to, are you living in a community property state? You have to check if the power of attorney is still valid. So if you got that power of attorney in a uniform power of attorney state, are you still in one of those states, or do you need to switch it? You need to review the trust, and then also reviewing the home ownership. So if you're moving and you have a new house, have the assets been titled properly? So community property states, are states where your marital assets are considered joint. So these are the states here. You'll notice a couple of, lower tax, I would say retiree friendly states, like Texas and Nevada on this list. And so just keeping an eye, here, on whether you're moving from kind of a common law to community property state will be important, because in that case, you'll need to get your assets retitled. We mentioned inheritance tax a little bit earlier. Some states actually levy their own estate tax. And so just being mindful that if you're moving to a state that has a state level estate tax, so that is just something that you need to account for in your plan. I think about that as, when you think about cost of living and a cost, it's a cost of living in that state, is that if you die in that state, that there will be a state estate tax associated to your assets. All right, so we're going to wrap up talking about what folks should think about if they're single, married, or divorced. And I want to just flag that we've set aside time for Q&A. So definitely drop your questions into the Q&A, and Teresa and I will go through those and answer them live as we get to the end of the seminar. So let's talk a little bit about estate planning if you're single. So the first thing here is just power of attorney is really important. So really thinking about who is that family, friend, member that's going to be provide that power of attorney for you. Reviewing beneficiaries to ensure that they reflect your current situation. So are you single and you've always been single? Are you single because you're divorced and actually your ex-spouse actually is listed as a beneficiary? Are you single because you're widowed or a widower, and again, your former spouse is listed as a beneficiary? So super important if you're single, just to review who those beneficiaries are. Also to review like who you might have stated as beneficiaries in your 20s versus who you actually want as beneficiaries today. I would also just flag that if you are single and you're in an unmarried partnership, important to understand the role of beneficiaries and also community property rules. So understanding whether or not your partnership is treated as a marriage in the state that you're living in or not. That can not only have impacts on your estate plan, but it can also impact your partner's ability to access spousal benefits for Social Security, as well as to be eligible to enroll in Social Security based on your work history. So if you're married, a couple things I would just flag to you is really making sure you think about a plan that works for both spouses. We talked a little bit earlier about, do you want your spouse being able to change the will after you die? So are you creating a will that can be edited after the death of a spouse, or are you creating a will that cannot be edited? When you go down that route of saying, I don't want the will edited, just keep in mind that you do want to retain flexibility for that one's partner that might outlive the other by many years. And so it is not uncommon to find folks that are outliving their spouses by 10 plus years. And so making sure that if you go the route of trying to have a less flexible will, just to understand what the implications might be for your partner. Keep the plan up to date as your family grows. So it may be that you've got a pool of money that you're looking to distribute to grandkids, making sure that the document acknowledges both current grandkids and perhaps grandkids that are born in the future. And here again, I would just double tap on, if you move, make sure to just check that, based on the states that you're moving to and from, that the estate plan is still valid. And then finally, for folks that are divorced, we've kind of talked, I guess, a little bit ad nauseum about this, but just to kind of hit the ball home, really making sure that your plan today meets your intentions post divorce. So making sure that you've renamed beneficiaries, that you've really thought about who your new power of attorney, as an example, might be. If you get remarried, really thinking about a plan that accounts for both family members or both families, and so really thinking about how are you dealing with the distribution of assets for your children versus your new spouse's children and the blended family. And so really needing to kind of document that to make sure that the assets are being distributed as expected. If you are not remarried but divorced, again, we just double tap on getting that power of attorney to really give you that peace of mind and make sure that you have someone who can act on your behalf if you need extra help. So I know we covered a lot of topics today in a pretty short period. What I wanted just to maybe end on is like the most important things to do, because there's a long list and it can feel a little bit overwhelming. And so if I was thinking about like the most important thing to do is, if you don't have a will, get a will in place. But if you have one, I think it's really important to take a look and make sure that the will really reflects your life today. Assigning and reviewing beneficiaries of all financial accounts, very important. Selecting a power of attorney. We didn't talk today about digital assets, but making sure that you have documented your digital assets. So this is things like passwords and access to any sort of digital assets that you have. And then really thinking about putting in place an advanced healthcare directive so there's someone who can make healthcare decisions on your behalf. So those are I would say, like the five super important things that I would highly recommend that everyone gets in place. There is a secondary list, and I'm just going to share them, but know that like to ask people to do 10 things after a webinar is a lot. But as you kind of think through other things to consider that might be relevant for you is just, if you're thinking about moving, making sure you understand the state specific laws, thinking about whether or not a trust is something that makes sense for you, deciding whether or not you want to make final arrangement plans in advance. Some folks have very specific views on how they want to be buried, what they want their funeral to look like, and so, really documenting that. Finding the appropriate way to discuss the plans with your loved ones. You don't have to share everything, and it could be that there's one family member that knows everything, and then a part of the family knows a little bit. Really, just thinking about how do you socialize that information. And the final thing I would just say is that, this is, I'd say, just part of good financial hygiene, which is reviewing your estate and your beneficiaries regularly. So it might be, every year, every couple of years, just taking the opportunity just to quickly check and see, does this document still reflect what our life looks like today and kind of the goals that we have? But again, if I was to go back to the top priorities, number one, it's making sure you have that will and or updating the will. And number two, it's beneficiaries. Add them and or make sure they're the right beneficiaries. That is, the beneficiary piece honestly is like the easiest thing to do. And Therese, you can hold me honest here, but you can walk into the branch at MSUFCU and they can walk you through that. So it is a very easy process to make those updates.
Mhm.
So with that, I wanted to maybe just pause. We have a lot more information that you can access online at msufcu.silver.com, but I wanted just to pause and see what questions we have so that we make sure that folks get the information they're looking for out of this webinar today.
Yes. All right, so we did have a few questions come through. So first question, any recommendations on how to go about creating a will or trust? I know we all see those, there's a lot of do-it-yourself types of things that you can also do, but what would you suggest is the best way to go about that? Or is it
Yeah,
just going to depend, on the
yeah. I mean, I
person's
think
situation?
it depends on how complicated you perceive your fact pattern to be. I think there are a lot of great online services today that if you're just looking to get a quick will in place, and it could be, as an example, you're traveling for the next couple months and you want to make sure you have something done before you go on vacation or on your big trip. An online service can be a great way to get started. If you perceive that your situation is a little bit more detailed and you're going to need to, you've got a bunch of questions, you're trying to figure out, how do you support a family member who has special needs. That's when actually talking to a kind of a human lawyer, I think, is going to help you get that more personalized plan. But I always say that something is better than nothing, right? And so just like the good hygiene to start with is, start with maybe an online will so that you have the foundation in place. You can also, through a lot of these platforms today, also put in place the healthcare proxies, et cetera.
Okay. Yeah, that kind of leads into our next question here. This attendee says they do have a durable power of attorney. I'm assuming she is the power of attorney for her mother, but is that good enough if a doctor has decided my mother cannot make her own decisions any longer?
So let's go back to sorry, go back a little bit to look at the different power of attorneys. So generally a durable, and this is where you'd need to triple check the document. A durable power of attorney is really related to the financial affairs. Typically, you'll also need an advance directive or a healthcare proxy if you're looking to take over health decisions on behalf of your parents. Again, like I would triple check that with either the lawyer who has put in place the existing power of attorney or with the hospital. But typically, I think about a general and durable power of attorney as being really more on the financial affairs, and that you separately need to get that healthcare directive or that advance directive or healthcare proxy.
Okay. So yeah, that'd definitely be something good to look into if you have, established someone as your power of attorney or if you are a power of attorney for your own parents. So Yeah, that's great. And then I know we kind of talked about like different life events and reviewing, but um, even if you don't have any life events, like how often would you say to kind of review your own will or trust?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's an element of like, do you add it into your annual tax prep? Like, it's just like
Hmm.
the last step of, kind of, because I think we all need habits, right? So, is there like, I do my taxes, and then once I get through that, like the month of May, is like, I just quickly check my will. I'm going to be super transparent and just admit that I don't, look at my will every single year. So I think the reality is that probably every 5 years, unless there's something big that's happening. And so again, I think we all know the different life events. I think there's also health events, right? So we talked about marital status changes, but if you have a healthcare scare, it's probably, and I think this is hard because as you're going through a healthcare scare, you're probably very focused on getting yourself the right treatment and the doctors. But it is, I think, important to pause and just think about, okay, do I actually have the right paperwork in place to both support me through this? And in the event that things don't go the way that we all hope, that actually I've got the, my will in place and I've got the protections around my assets.
Hmm. Yeah, that kind of hits home with me for sure because my parents are aging and um, we just found I actually asked them some of these questions. Doing hosting these seminars always helps me know what to talk to my own parents about. So, but yeah, it turns out that one of their trustees on their trust was my brother who had passed away 5 years ago, and they still hadn't updated that, So, and they hadn't even really crossed their mind.
Yeah.
Obviously, during that time, you're going through a lot, all of that. But so yes, definitely, this is good questions to ask if you are going through this. And then as far as like the digital assets, what should be done with digital assets and online accounts? Like how do you work that into your estate plan?
Yeah. So I think on the digital side, so the first thing is in the estate plan is documenting where all this information is held. So many of the password managers and digital account managers today allow you to authorize like I don't want to call it a beneficiary, but it's basically it's authorizing someone who can access those accounts. And typically they will need to file as an example. They'll typically that account will be unlocked for them, typically with like a certification of death and then proof of their own identity.
Mm,
But the first thing that we typically see folks struggling with, and sorry, I know we're still in the power of attorney, so I'm going to just move us back to the end. But typically, where we see folks struggling on the digital side is they don't even know where to look to find out what accounts, as an example, mom or dad have. And so there's this triage situation where you're trying to like, cancel their phone bill and you're like, okay, I can't even log in to the phone operator because I don't have the login credentials. And so I think step number one is like, where is that information held? I have heard of all sorts of creative places where folks are, storing all this information and then they forget to tell people where it's actually stored. And so
mm,
sometimes it's the most simple thing, which is document in your will where you're storing this information. It could be in a safe in your house, it could be in a specific folder on a desk. You're going to have your own strategy. It could be that you have it saved online somewhere, but you have to tell people where it is so they can actually access it.
yeah. Yep, that it was another part of the conversation I had with my parents recently, and my dad pulled out this old, notebook that had things scratched off
Mhm.
and other, and I'm just like, I don't think this is going to be good enough. Let's
Yeah.
work on this together. So, yes, that's all really great things to think about. So, all right.
And
Well,
I
I think
think part of that is thinking about how, look, again, and this is particularly from a caregiving perspective, um, is how do we create the urgency? And the way I think about it is, well, you're protecting your loved one. So, and also I think about, for so many of our family members, they've worked so hard to get to where they are. And the thought of a phone bill being charged for 5 months after they die is money that's really wasted, right? And they would prefer that
mhm,
money goes to the grandkid or the charity that they really care about. And so it's like, how do we motivate each other to kind of stay
mhm,
on top of these things so that again, everything you've worked hard for, stays within, the realms of what you're hoping for. And I think having that as more of I want to make sure that your goals are accomplished rather than I'm trying to like learn how much money you have in your bank account that I'm going to inherit.
right.
Like that conversation, no,
Yeah.
no one really wants to have, but it's the, okay,
Yeah.
you worked really hard. How do we make sure that we don't end up with this kind of collateral damage afterwards because no one knew where to find
Mhm.
information?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, well, that's awesome. Yeah, we looks like that's all the questions we had come through, but such great information. Once again, check out Retirement Simplified, msufcu.silver.com to sign up for that account where you can access all of this information. I'll also go ahead, there was a couple people that had already asked for the recording, so it doesn't go up on our YouTube channel for a few weeks. So I'll go ahead and send everyone that attended today in the follow-up email tomorrow. I'll send out the Zoom link so you can access the recording right away if you'd like. And that should be good there. So, also, I just wanted to let everyone know that we will have Silver back with us on a monthly basis for a noon session where we will cover just a lot of different topics throughout the year. So, if you enjoyed the session today, definitely visit msufcu.org/events to register for some other upcoming events with Silver. So I think that is all we have for today for everyone. If there's any other questions, go ahead and you can shoot me an email. I can, get that to Rian and we can get any other questions answered for you. We're always happy to help. So thank you again for being with us, Rian, and we will see you again next month.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye, everyone.